Good morning, and I'd like to first thank the City UK for inviting me to be with you all today. And in accepting, I had to think carefully about what I could helpfully talk about, because whether it takes 1 term, 2 terms, or longer, the reality is for me and my party that just 4 months after the general election, we're about as far away from the levers of power as we can be. Although that's not entirely true. Sadly, we don't have the mayoralty in the West Midlands anymore, but we have a very talented mayor in Teesside, in Ben Houchen, and Conservatives run over 50 councils across the UK. And so given the focus of this conference on devolution and growth across all our nations and regions, that point is worth remembering and more important than ever. But in Westminster, at least, there is a lot of work for us to do to win back people's trust. And so in the meantime, I thought there were 3 areas that I might be able to helpfully touch on today. And the first is what it's like as a new minister or a new advisor entering government. What are the common challenges faced regardless of political party? And how can everyone here today help the new government in the task that they have before them? The second was the importance of your industries to growth in the UK, particularly in the new global context that we face, and what that means for government policy. And as we heard a little bit about in the panel before, the reality is that there is more continuity here between the 2 main parties than either of us would care to admit sometimes. And that's no bad thing, because many of these are areas that require decisions for the long term. But lastly, also, what needs to change? Why did the previous government fail to deliver on all its ambitions for the country? And how can we learn from that in the future? So before diving in, it's perhaps worth telling you a bit more about myself. Before being a Treasury Minister and a Minister now at what is now MHCLG, which I think has changed its name as a department more time than the Conservatives have changed Prime Minister in recent years. Prior to that, I was Deputy Chief of Staff to Theresa May for her time in Downing Street. And I also worked as an advisor in the Home Office under 2 new governments in 2010 and 2015. And so from that experience, my first reflection that I would have for any new minister is, having spent so long trying to get into government, you now need to put a real effort into getting out again. And what I mean by that is it's just too easy to spend your time in the department. You have a red box that regenerates papers at an endless rate. You're preparing to face parliamentary questions and you've got to answer them, not just ask them. And you're surrounded by really smart people that can brief you on the answer to any topic or question that you might think come up. But that does all mean that you can become cut off from the people that you're trying to work with and you're trying to work for. And so conferences such as this are a fantastic way to hear from industry, and importantly also outside of Westminster and London. And I also found that the Darlington Economic Council campus, which is the home of the Treasury, but also other economic departments of the government in the north of England, was really transformative for informing the culture of government and the policy-making process. And the process of establishing DEC, as we called it, really resonates with the panel discussion that we've just heard, choosing the location in terms of connectivity and access to skills, but also the impact of having a really strong presence with senior leadership had on us as an organisation. So recruiting from different pools of people, drawing on different skills, and actually bringing a genuine diversity of thought to the policy-making process that we didn't have in the same way when we were only really operating out of London. And I'd encourage all ministers to spend as much time as they can working from that location. So ministers should be knocking down at your doors wanting to speak to you, but if they're not, knock down at their doors instead. Of course, know what you want to say and be articulate about the problem or issue that you want to raise. But more importantly, what is your preferred solution and what is the government's role in that? Is it something that a problem for the government to solve? Do they need to partner with you in addressing the issue? Or do they actually need to empower others to address the issue, either through devolution, maybe through getting out of the way, removing barriers to local people or local leaders solving a problem, or, as Rachel said, as a facilitator, maybe in terms of removing barriers to data sharing. I remember in the Home Office trying to progress work on tackling knife crime, and the barriers to sharing data between hospitals, local authorities and the police and national government was incredibly complicated, and it took a really long time to unwind all of that. When you're engaging with government, be clear on your priorities. If you think the changes are necessary but politically difficult, knowing what the one big thing is that will really shift the dial is really important. And it might not be politically difficult. It might just be time or resource consuming, and actually the need for pretty ruthless prioritisation if you actually want to get things done in government is absolutely essential. And it might also be surprising to hear me say this, but give the government the benefit of the doubt. There is the old political maxim of cock up, not conspiracy. Ministers will still be putting together their teams and getting to grips with how the machinery of government works. And decisions can be made with unintended consequences, or there may be issues that you're experiencing every day that ministers are unaware of. So tell them. And my number one recommendation in this area, if you're a minister within government or a business or a trade association or anyone with an interest in policy, regulation or spending, if you have a submission for the budget, start it the day after the previous budget. Ignore budget submission deadlines. That is way too late in the process. Really successful policies are those that are developed with those most affected by them, and that takes time. I think I heard in the panel someone talking about collaboration, not just consultation, and that's essential. That doesn't allow for the rabbit out of the hat on budget day, but it does mean that you'll get well thought through policies which deliver what you want them to. And I think it also means avoiding pitfalls, for example, that the current government are facing when it comes to inheritance tax changes for farmers. And all of this is something that the City UK as an organisation working on your behalf is extremely adept at, and it actually helps that they now have an alumni as a minister bringing together two really important areas of policy in the Treasury and in pensions. And I think you can see the success of that work in the clarity and the continuity of many of the policy areas affecting financial and professional services. So Labour's new National Wealth Fund is going to build out of the UK infrastructure bank created under the last government. The pillars of the new industrial strategy closely mirror Jeremy Hunt's growth sectors because they are both fundamentally based on the UK's strengths as an economy. The plans to go further with devolution, with mayoral authorities in every part of the country that wants them, and devolving areas such as adult skills funding continues what was in progress already. And the Chancellor's Mansion House speech builds on the reforms started by Jeremy Hunt or even George Osborne when it comes to merging local government pension schemes. And in fact, across financial and professional services, there was a remarkable amount of consensus between the two main parties when we were legislating for the UK's new regulatory framework outside of the EU in the 2023 Financial Services and Markets Act, which I took through the House of Lords. And as I said before, in many ways, that continuity is no bad thing. It was actually better for all of us if politicians were more clear about where we agreed and didn't spend time creating difference for the sake of it. And as I said also, it's a good thing because the focus on these areas are the focus on things that will help drive growth, rebalancing our economy away from London and the southeast, ensuring that the industries of the future and jobs of the future grow and flourish, And that's where your work is so important, not just in providing the capital for the latest tech or life sciences startup to scale and flourish, but also as innovators and tech companies yourselves. But stability itself won't engender a return to the level of growth and productivity rates that we want as a nation and that we need if we're going to invest in and fund our public services in the way that we want to. So we also need change, and that's an agenda that Kemi Badenoch has started to set out as the new leader of the opposition. So lastly, I thought I should expand on that a bit further and reflect on how you can help us in opposition to hold the government to account on delivering growth today, but also feeding in the creative ideas for the changes that we need tomorrow. And Kemi actually set out a lot of her vision when addressing the City UK's international conference earlier this year. She spoke about her own time working in banking, working in compliance, where her dislike of burdensome and quite often needless regulation was born. And she reflected that the challenge for those of us in Parliament is that we do have a tendency towards creating more rules. Show us a problem and we will try and legislate to fix it through very good intentions. But that is sometimes not necessarily what we need. Maybe we need better enforcement of the existing rules. Maybe we need innovation to solve the problem or change the nature of the risk rather than trying to regulate it. I think Laura also spoke about the need for national government to genuinely let go, and she reflected on the single settlement for the West Midlands and Manchester, and I think there's far more to go on that. But when I look across government in our time, but it's something that will continue and needs to be addressed, is the tendency to create multiple pots of money focused on different sectors or different aims, all with short timelines for delivery, all with different strings attached. And it's a really inefficient way of a government trying to enact the very genuine policy aims that it has. Now, we're not in the stage of opposition where we will be committing to specific policies. If Labour were implementing Keir Starmer's leadership campaign, they would have abolished tuition fees rather than raised them. We'd still have freedom of movement, and we'd not just be nationalising the railways, but water, Royal Mail and energy. And that might sound very appealing to some, but ultimately Labour decided it wasn't a realistic programme for government. So instead, at this stage, we're focusing on what are the principles we need to follow to generate greater levels of growth. Minimising bureaucracy, doing a few things well, not to intervene constantly and inconsistently, and have rules that are clear and simple. And we need smart regulation to protect against fraud, the provision of adequate capital buffers in a whole host of areas, but it does feel like the balance has tipped too far in favour of bureaucracy and against the individual consumer, entrepreneur or innovator. As Andy Haldane has pointed out, in the 1980s, the UK had one regulator for every 11,000 people in the financial sector. That went down to 1 in every 300 by 2013. So we need to redress the balance. And it was good, again, to hear Rachel Reeves address the same point in her Mansion House speech, where she said the changes to our regulatory system that have sought to eliminate risk have been taken too far. But in taking that insight and turning it into concrete changes is really hard. And it's not clear that that's where Labour's instincts lie. For example, at the same time as committing to regulate for growth, they're implementing new employment legislation that could cost businesses up to £5 billion to comply with. And the report by the Regulatory Policy Committee, I think out yesterday, said that that could be an underestimate. So we will hold Labour to account for their commitment to redress the regulatory balance. And as we move from principles to policy, we will need the input of everyone in this room as to how we can strengthen the sector and how we can build on its role as a catalyst for growth across the whole of the UK. The benefit of opposition is that one of the few benefits, is that you have the opportunity to take the time to engage with new ideas and new ways of doing things. As a smaller team, you can be more nimble and responsive to change. but you are also incredibly under-resourced, to be frank. But the silver lining of that is that you have to reach out and collaborate and innovate to solve policy problems. And that's something that we would like to do with everyone here in the UK. And just in closing, I'd like to touch on something else that Kemi has said in the past, and I think has also come out in the discussion we've already heard so far, and I'm sure will throughout the rest of the day. And it's something that's maybe not said enough, and that's the social value, not just the economic value of financial and professional services. The ability of a strong financial sector to bring investment and growth, to deliver infrastructure, but most of all, to make people's lives better is absolutely phenomenal. And that's a contribution of everyone here in this room. So thank you for that. Thank you for having me here today. And I look forward to working with everyone on a shared agenda in the years ahead. So thank you.